The revolution which broke out in Germany at the end of the First World War and overthrew the Kaiser was one of the old and the middle-aged. It had not started on the front line, and the majority of troops did not sympathize with it. For the youth, this was especially the case. In fact, it was often the case that the leading figures in this revolution were not German at all. Upon their return from the front, the majority of German youths kept their distance from the vast array of new political parties which cropped up. They simply weren't interested. They instead found their homes in the youth leagues and the political extremes. The list of youth organizations on both sides of the political aisle were endless. The youth of Germany was completely fractured. Both sides, however, rejected the old regime and the attempt to bring back the status quo. Both sides had a sense of mission to create a new Germany. The two sides, when speaking of Germans at least, had far more in common than they had differences. The man who was able to heal these divides was Adolf Hitler, a man who espoused both nationalism and socialism. For now, this man of strange origins kept his terms ill-defined. He could be all things to all men. It was in 1922, when the National Socialist Party was still very much a regional, Bavarian affair, that the idea was hatched of creating a youth movement. This is the story of the Hitler Youth. A couple things before we begin. Firstly, a quick disclaimer. This video is purely a work of history and is in no way, shape, or form political. Please don't overthink it and make it into something it is not. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to those of you who have signed up on Subscribestar as a YouTube member or on Ko-Fi. The latter platform especially has been incredibly helpful, as I was recently arbitrarily banned from Buy Me a Coffee, and so your one-time donations and subscriptions there have really gone a long way to fix that mess. If you aren't already signed up, then please do consider doing so in one of the links in the description. It is purely thanks to your kind donations that I'm able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you enough. Even the lowest $5 tier helps immensely. Cheers. In December 1921, a piano polisher named Gustav Adolf Lenk attempted to join the NSDAP, but was rejected for not quite being 18 years of age yet. His logical next question was to ask whether the party had a youth organization. After receiving a negative answer, he was invited to build one up, although within the party, this resulted in a rather mixed response. Hitler himself did not need much convincing after Lenk bombarded him with letters suggesting the idea. Anton Drexler, one of the founders of the party, required a bit more persuading and thought that the idea of essentially running a kindergarten would be too much of a burden at this early stage. Could the NSDAP not just later take over many of the already existing youth organizations further down the line, he reasoned. As of that year, however, this was Hitler's party, not Drexler's. On the 25th of February 1922, Hitler addressed a circular to all sections of the NSDAP and the SA, quote, "Because of the increase of inquiries reaching the party leadership, asking whether the movement has its own youth section, we have decided to call into existence the necessary organization for the purpose of setting up a youth section. The statutes of the party are in no way a hindrance to this, but on the contrary, by implication, carry provision for this next step. The organization of the youth section will be conducted by the Sturmabteilung, which will immediately work out in detail organizational statutes, which, upon their completion, will be forwarded to the individual local party districts. Therefore, as from now, all correspondence concerning a youth section is to be addressed to the headquarters of the SA." End quote. On the 18th of March, a public proclamation appeared in the party newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, calling for the creation of this youth movement. Quote, "The party has now called into being a youth league of the National Socialist Workers' Party, whose purpose it is to gather all our young supporters, who, because of their young age, cannot be accepted into the ranks of the stormtroopers. The movement has its own statutes. It will educate its members in the same spirit which characterizes the party. We believe that the name of League alone is sufficient to guarantee that our youths will receive the best possible training for their difficult task in the future. Upon their shoulders rests the future of our fatherland. The Youth League of the NSDAP will ensure that these shoulders will be strong enough someday to be able to carry this gigantic weight. We demand that the National Socialist Youth and all other young Germans, irrespective of class or occupation, aged between 14 and 18 years of age, whose hearts are affected by the suffering and hardships afflicting the fatherland, and who later desire to join the ranks of the fighters against the Jewish enemy, the sole originator of our present shame and suffering, enter the Youth League of the NSDAP. We appeal also to youth organizations, which at present are not part of any political movement, to join the German United Front against a common enemy by joining us, thus creating a mighty battering ram. To enable the poorest young Germans also to enter into our youth league, we shall not levy a membership fee. We expect and hope, however, for generous contributions from party members with greater means at their disposal." End quote. A few days later, the statutes for the youth movement were published. Point 1 made the Youth League an integral part of the party. The second laid out the point that the League would embody the same spirit as the party itself, and that the League was to be for all those who wished to join the SA upon their 18th birthday. Point 3 laid out the aims of the Youth League, including the reawakening and treasuring of German characteristics such as, quote, love of one's country and people, enjoyment of honest open combat and of healthy physical activity, the veneration of ethical and spiritual values, and the rejection of those values originating from Jewry and Mammon, end quote. Point 3 also went on to state that the movement ignored all differences of class, occupation, or social standing. These differences, it said, quote, are contradictory to the ancient concepts of a community of race and blood and of all German people, end quote. Point 4 stated that the youth movement's spirit was to be cultivated by weekly meetings, lectures, hiking trips, and games of all kinds, which required maximum physical activity. Point 5 limited membership to Germans between the ages of 14 to 18 only. Foreigners and Jews were not allowed in. Point 6 simply reiterated that there was to be no membership fee. Point 7 went into greater detail regarding activities. On every second Sunday, there would be a compulsory hike through the countryside. In order to prevent the intrusion of trashy literature, the Youth League was to establish its own libraries, which were to be filled with voluntarily donated good books. The party was at this point still rather small, and so it took until the 13th of May before a public meeting could take place at the Berger Braukeller in Munich, where the Youth League was officially proclaimed. Only 17 of those in attendance were youths, despite the venue being packed to capacity. Here, after making speeches alongside Hitler and others, Gustav Adolf Lenk was entrusted with the leadership of the Youth League. His movement was to be subordinate to the SA, and the first uniforms were to be modelled on that organisation. The Youth League was to be split into two. One half of the league was to cater for 14 to 16-year-olds, the other for 16 to 18-year-olds. The latter was to be called the Jungsturm Adolf Hitler, whose uniform was almost exactly like that of the SA, which would often cause confusion for outsiders. The first appearance of the Jungsturm SA was to be on the 28th of January 1923, during the first official party rally in Munich. Here, the youngsters were presented their first pennants. This was merely the first public appearance. In the background, Lenk had been busy and proven himself a very capable organizer. On his personal initiative, small units of the Youth League were founded in Nuremberg, as well as outside Bavaria in Zeitz, Dresden, Hanau, and Dortmund. Lenk also had made a lot of connections in Austria and worked closely with the NSDAP's sister party there. Lenk was always wanting to push things further and often found the supposed narrow-mindedness of the party leadership infuriating. He did, however, sometimes get his way. In May 1923, he published the first youth magazine for the National Socialist Youth League, titled National Jungsturm. This turned out to be a financial fiasco, which was dead on arrival. The magazine was instead downsized into a regular supplement of the Völkische Beobachter. In general, this time period was one of crisis. Hitler had promised the world, but many within the party felt that things simply weren't happening fast enough. They wanted revolution, and they wanted it now. The Führer had preached for the overthrow of the November criminals and the destruction of, in his words, the Jew Republic. All this, and yet nothing seemed to have happened. In the Ruhr, Hitler had come out against the policy of passive resistance, and instead stated that the overthrow of the Berlin government should be the priority. Amongst the SA, there was an ever-increasing restlessness, especially when inflation began to spiral out of control, and the country seemed ripe for collapse. Between May and November, there was a steady decline in SA membership. It all seemed to be going wrong. All this pressure culminated in Hitler having to take a mad gamble if he were to remain at the head of the movement. This was, of course, the Beer Hall Putsch. Predictably, it all ended in fiasco, but Lenk, who was present at the Berger Braukeller, prudently decided to make sure that the younger members of the Jungsturm stayed in their homes that evening. Many of the boys were kept occupied with messenger tasks, but some of the older boys simply couldn't be stopped and got involved with Hitler's doomed march regardless. That day, the 9th of November, ended up being the end of not only the first NSDAP, but also the Jungsturm Adolf Hitler and the Youth League in general. During the petty infighting which followed Hitler's arrest, Lenk, foolishly, decided to reform the Youth League under a different name. This was immediately detected by the Bavarian police, whereupon the new movement was dissolved and Lenk was imprisoned. After his release, he then proceeded to do the exact same thing again, but this time he set himself up just north of the Bavarian border in the Vogtland, a region which straddles Thuringia and Saxony. Despite the relocation, Lenk still found himself in trouble with the Bavarian authorities, and he was once again arrested, but then released on parole a month later with Hitler on the 20th of December 1924. In February 1925, Hitler skillfully managed to patch up the fractured remnants of the NSDAP by simply letting the splinter groups destroy themselves, and then, when the time was right, reforming the party from the ground up. The decision was a prudent one. Almost all of the old comrades began to rally around the Führer, rather than figures like Ludendorff or Gregor Strasser. To Lenk, however, it did not seem that Hitler's leadership of the movement was consolidated just yet, and so he kept himself aloof and went it alone, forming the German Defense Youth Association independently of the NSDAP. This was to be the worst mistake of his life. He was immediately branded a traitor by his fellow nationalists and ended up being convicted on what may have been a trumped-up charge of petty theft. He subsequently withdrew from the youth movement scene altogether. Initially, he tried making a scene of the whole thing by the means of an article in the Volgische Beobachter. He stated his reasons as being economic pressure combined with opposition to his own personality within the party. On top of that, he added that party officials simply did not understand the youth movement. This latter concern was to be echoed by Hitler Youth leaders Kurt Gruber and Baldur von Schirach. Lenk's article, however, was not published. He faded into relative obscurity, and his later attempts to rejoin the SA, the party in general, and the Hitler Youth came to nothing. Lenk was gone, but what he had left behind was invaluable. His Greater German Youth movement, which had been founded in the Vogtland, was being led by Kurt Gruber, a student of law who had joined the NSDAP in May 1923, but did not participate in the putsch. By the time Hitler and Lenk left Landsberg, Gruber had organized in Saxony alone a youth movement around 2,500 strong, and he'd built up the necessary administrative apparatus. For a short while, Gruber got together with Ernst Röhm's forces and adopted the name Front-Jugend, but after Hitler reduced the responsibilities of the SA, Röhm temporarily left the party, and Gruber went back to the old name. Keeping afloat during this period was thanks to the funding given by Martin Mutschmann, a local textile manufacturer. Martin himself would go on to join the NSDAP and become a Gauleiter. This funding allowed the youth movement to have, for now, a certain degree of independence, which allowed it to grow and even expand into other regions of Germany unhindered by party bureaucracy. The members of the youth movement swore an oath to Adolf Hitler and abided by the Führer principle, but ultimately they were not yet an integral part of the party apparatus, which Hitler was in the process of rebuilding still. Whilst the Führer was going through this process, he was unfamiliar with Gruber personally, and there was an air of suspicion around him due to this independence from the party, and so he wasn't actually Hitler's first choice. Instead, the Führer tasked Edmund Heinz, one of Röhm's fellow homosexuals, to deal with, quote, all matters relating to the youth movement, end quote. This wasn't the same as appointing Heinz as youth leader, and even this half-measure caused uproar within the party. Heinz was one of the leaders of the Schuljugend, which was seen as an elitist and predominantly middle-class body, which had no time for their working-class comrades. Gruber, quite rightly, refused to subordinate himself to Heinz's movement and went directly to the Führer with the matter. Hitler was told point-blank that the working classes of Germany would not get on with such an effeminate and snobbish movement. The issue was left adrift, whilst the working and middle-class movements squabbled over who should be subordinate to who, or whether the different groups should be kept separate with a certain degree of autonomy. Gruber's talent solved the problem for everyone. He continued to go from strength to strength, and the Führer put his faith in Gruber and his working-class lads unreservedly. At the party rally in Weimar on the 4th of July 1926, Gruber's Greater German Youth Association was renamed to the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth. Gruber himself was made Reichsführer of the Hitler Youth, as well as advisor for youth questions in the party headquarters in Munich. Gruber, however, refused to move to the office waiting for him in Munich. He preferred to remain in Plauen, far away from Munich. Here, he established the Hitler Youth Leadership Office and divided it into 14 separate departments, including departments for education, welfare, military sport, propaganda, and film. The latter did not actually make films, but rather distributed approved films for local Hitler Youth units. It was not long before the party tried to pull on Gruber's leash. Pfeffer von Salomon, the leader of the SA, immediately set about subordinating the Hitler Youth to the SA once he was appointed. Gruber quickly became incredibly suspicious, but he reluctantly invited Salomon to the first Hitler Youth Leaders meeting at Weimar in December 1926. Here, Salomon was able to calm all of Gruber's suspicions, and he was turned into a ready collaborator. From now on, all Hitler Youth members above the age of 18 had to be party members. All appointments to the higher ranks of the Hitler Youth were to have agreement of the NSDAP. The same went for any public appearances. For the first time ever, a membership fee was introduced of 4 pfennigs per month. Uniforms were to be standardized and deliberately designed to not be confused with the SA ones. At around this time, the Hitler Youth had an estimated membership of between 700 and 1,000 boys, and other youth movements were beginning to merge into what was clearly being seen as the future. The Hitler Youth was becoming so important that whenever there were disputes with the SA leadership, the Hitler Youth tended to come out on top. Hitler was, after all, building for the long term. Gruber's efforts were rewarded in 1927 when his boys joined Hitler for the party rally in Nuremberg. For the first time, 300 of them took part, many of them making their way all the way to the city on foot. As noted, the Hitler Youth tended to get priority over the SA, and it was now that Hitler felt he was much freer from SA dependency. In his own words, quote, "At this time, organization as an end in itself ceased. The idea began to be effective. Young men worked and managed to give the Hitler Youth a face of its own. Soon, one could see the results and the successes of this untiring tough work. Signs of its own life became evident in the Hitler Youth. The continuous participation with the SA and the party ceased. The boys started to go on their own hikes, to hold their own meetings and gatherings, in their own fashion," end quote. Despite all these steps in the right direction, the entire NSDAP was still a rather hand-to-mouth affair, and funding was hard to come by. The Hitler Youth itself was almost entirely funded by private sources, as well as from members, rather than by party funds. Regardless, both the party and the Hitler Youth continued to go from strength to strength. Not, of course, without hurdles. The May elections of 1928 only brought the NSDAP 12 seats in the Reichstag, and the much disliked Weimar Republic seemed to be stabilizing somewhat. Regardless, the party stood at 108,000 members, up from 27,000 members 4 years beforehand. To close out the year, Gruber convened a meeting of the entire Hitler Youth leadership at Plauen. After passing a well-deserved vote of confidence, the Young Volk was announced, which was to be junior groups for those aged 10 to 14. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM for short, was also set up, translated as the League for German Girls. A Hitler Youth news service was also announced to break the, quote, Jewish monopoly on news, end quote. The Hitler Youth was clearly branching out, but there were problems behind the scenes. During the meeting, Gruber once more emphasized the separation between the NSDAP itself and the Hitler Youth, and he had good reason to. Elsewhere, the National Socialist Student Movement had been founded and was currently led by Baldur von Schirach, who had aspirations to use this student organization as the lever of power to absorb all the rest under his own leadership. In fact, Schirach had already put out feelers about this, and word had gotten back to Gruber, who had to embark on a round of mass persuasion to keep all his Hitler Youth subordinates on side. In order to impress the Führer and stay at the helm, Gruber ramped up the press activity of the Hitler Youth, and by spring 1929, he could boast of 2 monthlies as well as a bi-weekly. Gruber also went on a speaking tour that spring, and in March and April alone, he spoke at 32 Hitler Youth rallies throughout the country. At that year's Nuremberg rally, 2,000 Hitler Youth boys were able to proudly march past the Führer. Around half of this number had come from Austria, and the Berlin contingent had marched the entire way from their city on foot. This march was to be repeated every year going forwards, the Adolf Hitler March, as they termed it. Shortly before the end of the rally, the Führer personally came to see all the Hitler Youth boys in their tents, and Gruber got the impression that he had once and for all won the struggle against Schirach. He had good reason to believe this. Under his leadership, the Hitler Youth had gone from 80 branches in 1926 to 450 in 1929. Membership had meanwhile gone from between 700 and 1,000 to a whopping 13,000. On the 20th of March 1930, the Hitler Youth was invited to Berlin to join its first major mass rally, which was conducted under the motto, "From resistance to attack." Dr. Goebbels, Gauleiter of Berlin, was to be the head speaker. It wasn't all good news. The increased public political activity of the Hitler Youth had caused reactions from the authorities, including banning marches and, some regions, banned schoolboys from becoming members. This came at a time in which the radicalization of German politics had returned. Within months of the Great Depression, the same atmosphere as had existed at the end of the war arrived. Civil war seemed to be on the cards, and the German people were rushing to the extremes. The petty restrictions from the regional and national governments were simply free propaganda for the NSDAP. and the population was becoming ever more eager to hear them out. Pupils who were expelled or fined for their membership were quite rightly able to state that they were being persecuted for their patriotism and were painted as martyrs. Those who ended up going to prison were especially able to claim this mantle. To be persecuted for your patriotic beliefs was something to be proud of, not something to be avoided. The state was overplaying its hand massively, and Hitler Youth activity went on as usual, regardless of the repercussions. They even, in a way, got their own back. In December 1930, the Hitler Youth disturbed the first performance of All Quiet on the Western Front in both Berlin and Vienna. They were so methodical and thorough that the government was forced to cave to their pressure and simply withdrew the film from circulation. The biggest event of that year, though, was of course the election. The SPD remained the largest party, but the NSDAP rose to second place with 107 seats. The Hitler Youth were instrumental in this victory and more than carried their weight. An endless routine of rallies, publicity meetings, propaganda marches and parents' evenings kept up the momentum, and in rural areas, just like the SA, the Hitler Youth motored through in lorries with banners flying, chanting battle songs, or shouting election slogans. To the youth of Germany, it really felt like they were finally a part of something big, and that they were doing something important. It's no underestimation to say that these boys had something to live or even die for. Regardless of the election results, which were good, but obviously not a victory, the morale of the Hitler Youth was sky high. Everything was to change on the 27th of April, 1931. Ernst Röhm had now since returned from his exile in Bolivia to reclaim his spot at the top of the SA. Hitler, to obtain this appointment, had had to handle him carefully and tended to take his side on disputes to be on the safe side. On that day in April, the Führer issued a directive which made Gruber directly subordinate to the Chief of Staff of the SA, that being Röhm, who could also exercise direct command of the Hitler Youth if he wanted to. All Hitler Youth groups were made subordinate to their regional SA commanders, and the headquarters was relocated from Plauen to Munich. The days of autonomy were over. Gruber quickly found himself quarrelling with everyone as he saw his position slipping away. Many of his subordinates changed sides when they saw which way the wind was blowing. Gruber sealed his own fate during one conversation with Röhm, in which the SA leader was questioning why the Hitler Youth was growing so slowly since the 1930 elections, despite the NSDAP numbers climbing massively. Gruber blurted out a rash promise to double Hitler Youth membership to 50,000 by the end of 1931, an impossible promise to keep. In late 1931, the party headquarters in Munich announced that they had accepted Gruber's resignation, a resignation which he had never even submitted. The reasons were never given, and Gruber seems to have learnt of his own departure from the morning papers. Even the police were taken aback that he had been fired so randomly after devoting so much time and energy to the project. Older von Schirach would go on to say that Gruber had worked himself to a standstill, but this doesn't really ring true. Put simply, it appears that Schirach, by the means of his friendship with Ernst Röhm, had managed to overthrow Gruber. He now, naturally, took the reins. Baldur von Schirach was nothing like the man he had replaced. Schirach was no social revolutionary, nor a dynamic youth leader. He was more of an administrator, and one that rapidly became corrupted at that. He was of noble Sorbian and American stock, a man far removed from the German working classes. Hitler followed up the appointment by issuing a directive which essentially made the Hitler Youth a unit of the SA under the direct control of Ernst Röhm. Due to the friendship between Röhm and Schirach, the relationship between the Hitler Youth and the SA remained smooth, and in the early days, Schirach proved himself an able administrator who was respected by his boys due to the levels of party backing he enjoyed. Gruber, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. The takeover was immediately followed by expansion. The National Socialist Pupils League, which had been founded in Hamburg, was swallowed up by the Hitler Youth. This essentially middle-class organization was comprised of secondary school pupils and had a somewhat snobby air about it. Until 1931, they had enjoyed even more autonomy than the Hitler Youth. They had become well known for physically and verbally attacking Jewish or leftist teachers. The departure of Gruber also meant the end of unpaid voluntary work. All successors and office holders in the Hitler Youth leadership would now be full-time officials who received a small salary during a time of rapidly rising unemployment. For a time, those with the rank of Gruppenführer and Gauführer also received a very small monthly allowance, but ultimately this became unrealistic and stopped being paid reliably during the endless string of elections in 1932. This period was a turbulent one, not just financially, but physically. Between 1931 and 1933, 23 Hitler Youth boys would lose their lives in the political struggle. After all, the Hitler Youth anthem did go, quote, "We march for Hitler through night and suffering with the banner of freedom and bread. Our banner means more to us than death." End quote. These were the years in which the Reds stepped up their violence and the National Socialists dished out their fair share in return. Between the 1st of June and the 20th of July 1932, there were 322 acts of terror in Prussia, excluding Berlin, resulting in 72 deaths and 497 injuries. The Prussian Ministry of the Interior recorded that in 203 of these cases, the attackers were communists, and 72 were National Socialists. 21 members of the Reichsbanner, the paramilitary of the Social Democrats, and in the remaining 26 cases, guilt could not be established. The most famous Hitler Youth victim of this era of violence was Herbert Norkus, and after 1933, the party would make a film in his memory. Norkus was the son of a Berlin taxi driver who had felt the full brunt of the Depression and ended up joining the SA. His son, following in his father's footsteps, joined the Hitler Youth. On the 26th of January 1932, he was sent out to post advertisements for an NSDAP meeting, which was to be held 4 days later, featuring prominent Hitler Youth leaders as speakers. On that cold January morning, at 5 a.m., Norkus and his comrades were in his home district of Wedding, Berlin, doing this peaceful task. As they did so, a motorcyclist passed them, returned, passed again, and then vanished into the darkness. Then, suddenly, out of nowhere, the group of boys were confronted with a troop of adult communists. The boys, being only children, had nothing to do but flee in every direction. Norkus was not to be one of the lucky ones. He was caught and stabbed twice. Despite his injuries, he had just enough strength to make a dash for a house, but the owner cruelly shut the door right in his face. He was then stabbed again as he used every last ounce of strength he had to pull himself to his feet. Leaving a bloody trail of handprints along the wall, he pushed himself onwards, but it was too late. The assassins dragged his weakening body along a back street and left him there to die. A later autopsy found that he had received 5 stabs in the back, 2 in the chest, and his face had been completely mutilated beyond recognition. His upper lip had been cut off and couldn't even be found. Norkus was merely one of many who fell victim to this type of vicious communist violence. Of all those killed leading up to 1933, the oldest was 18 years of age, whereas the youngest was only 12. In Norkus's home district of Wedding, he was merely one of 3 boys who ended up as Hitler Youth martyrs. When Germans heard of the fates of boys like little Norkus, their reaction can only be imagined. Not only did it not put boys off joining the Hitler Youth, but it simply inspired more to sign up. To them, they were joining a great moral cause, something real, and, quite literally, something to die for. Werner Gerhardt, a boy who gave his life for the cause in 1932, uttered his famous final dying words to his mother, quote, "Don't cry, mother. I know I must die for Hitler." End quote. Joseph Goebbels' job could barely even be called propaganda when he recounted such horrifying encounters with the Reds. He merely needed to state the truth of what had happened. 1932 saw an absolute explosion of Hitler Youth membership. The true figures are impossible to guess, and membership fees cannot be used as an indicator due to unemployed members not having to pay fees. The party itself said that in January 1932 there were 37,000 members, and that in March this had risen to 72,821. These figures were used in secret internal reports, which suggests that any exaggerations were only on the smaller side, potentially in an attempt to get more funds from headquarters. These new recruits were mostly coming from the endless list of other German youth movements, as by now, Germans, both young and old, were consolidating into the 2 perceived extremes of communism and National Socialism. There were, however, also substantial numbers of young men crossing over from red to brown. In terms of class, the Munich Upper Bavaria Gau gives us the figures for the Hitler Youth from 1931 to 32. 69% were listed as workers, 10% were engaged in trade and commerce, and 12% were pupils. The remainder were either undetermined or unemployed, although mostly the latter. One Hitler Youth leaflet from Kiel in 1932 made the following appeal, quote, "Fellow youths, we shall overthrow the old system. We are not begging for your votes in the Reichstag election. What we want is you. The German Revolution begins on the day of the National Socialist seizure of power. Then, the young socialist forces from all camps must be united to face the forces of reaction. Our banners do not carry the slogans of Moscow or internationalism or pacifism. The only name they carry is that of Germany, and nothing but Germany. With your banners flying, come to us, the German workers' youth. Fight with us against the old system, against the old order, against the old generation. We're the last fighters for liberty. Fight with us for socialism, for freedom, and for bread. Join the German workers' youth." Kiel, end quote. H.W. Koch writes in his book, The Hitler Youth, regarding the organization's Herculean efforts in other deprived areas, quote, Propaganda marches were organized through the towns and villages of Schleswig-Holstein, a region which had already been radicalized as a result of widespread mortgage foreclosures and the forced auctions of farms and livestock of farmers no longer able to pay their taxes. They had organized themselves into self-defense units, which first prevented the bailiffs driving away stock or taking possession of farms, and ultimately led to the blowing up of local inland revenue offices. In Schleswig-Holstein, the Kiel Hitler Youth can be said to have contributed more to turn votes into account for the NSDAP than the party's own local apparatus, end quote. By year's end, the Hitler Youth was able to report that it now had a whopping total of 107,956 members. This was despite the Brüning government's ban on the NSDAP's uniformed branches that year. The Hitler Youth simply temporarily renamed themselves to the National Socialist Youth Movement, and the illegality only served to attract even more boys to the cause. The government also attempted to ban outdoor demonstrations. On one March occasion, the Hitler Youth leaders simply took their meeting indoors instead and handed out colours to each Hitler Youth unit, which was gathered there that day. They all read, quote, "We dedicate our flags in the sign of resurrection. May God bless our banners. For the final victory, we fight ourselves," end quote. The Hitler Youth also gained complete autonomy that year, as Hitler freed Chirac from Rome and made him an official of the party headquarters in his own right. In June, Chancellor Brüning was ousted and replaced by Franz von Papen. One of his first actions was to revoke the decrees banning uniforms. In his mind, this would win him the support of the NSDAP, but obviously, Hitler took this for what it was, a sign of weakness. Thanks to Hitler's pressure on Papen, elections were held in July, and the NSDAP obtained 13,745,000 votes and 230 seats in the Reichstag, which made them the largest party. Hitler singled out the Hitler Youth for praise after this victory and considered their indefatigable efforts when it came to distributing propaganda to have made a major contribution. They had indeed done their part, and they had passed out a whopping 20 million pamphlets and newspapers. Chirac himself had even campaigned for a Reichstag seat and won. He could now travel at the state's expense as he attempted to destroy it. The NSDAP had not won a majority, however, and the electioneering had absolutely drained the party's coffers, leaving them now in a very precarious situation. Regardless, the Hitler Youth was able to come together for a great show of strength in Potsdam. Hitler was skeptical, but Chirac remained steadfast, and the Führer relented. He was right to do so. The so-called Reich Youth Day of the NSDAP was a resounding success. The expected number of participants was 20,000, but on the day, there were 100,000 boys and girls all present. The preparations by Hitler Youth standards had been gigantic, but, clearly, they had not been gigantic enough. One Munich Hitler Youth group simply boarded a bus and convinced the driver to take them all the way to Berlin, and said that in return, they would pay for the petrol. The patriotic driver seemingly found this to be a good deal, and said there was a bus for Munich's municipal transport at Potsdam that day. The driver ended up being fired for his decision, but he was reinstated with an honorary Hitler Youth rank when Hitler became Chancellor in January. Only 50 tents were available in Potsdam for the event, and empty nearby factories had to be used to provide extra accommodation. From all around the country, the hordes of young boys and girls came flooding in by rail, by bus, and on foot with their banners held high whenever they entered a hamlet, village, or town. Despite their worn-out boots and aching feet, they sang their same old marching songs with boundless enthusiasm. Their total victory seemed inevitable. The youth had well and truly been captured by Adolf Hitler and his message of hope for the future. The first evening camp took place on the 1st of October, and the whole event was to prove the Hitler Youth's finest hour by far so far. Walter von Schirach led his boys to the garrison church of Potsdam to lay a wreath at the coffins of Frederick William I and Frederick the Great before the main event in which the main march past took place, with the boys marching from 11 a.m. until 6 p.m. The skeptical Führer unexpectedly turned up to watch and could be seen with tears in his eyes, barely able to contain his emotions. Koch writes, quote, "The psychological impact of the mass rally upon its participants cannot be overstated. Small groups of Hitler Youths operating for months, even years, in a state of semi-isolation in working-class districts, facing hostile parents, teachers, or workmates, suddenly had the experience of being part of one whole, of knowing that beside themselves, there were thousands of others in Germany, all fighting for the same cause with the same aim." End quote. On the 30th of January, 1933, after the establishment had exhausted every means, legal or illegal, to keep Hitler out, he finally became Chancellor. That evening, the Hitler Youth were able to be amongst those who proudly marched past their Führer and President Hindenburg in a torchlight procession. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed. which gave the Führer dictatorial powers for a period of 4 years. Hitler now had a clear path ahead of him to do what he wished to resurrect Germany, and the Hitler Youth leadership, quite naturally, wanted to take full advantage. With the full power of the state on their side, the Hitler Youth now began to absorb all competition. Their goal was nothing less than a monopoly on the youth of Germany. On the 3rd of April, the offices of the Reichscommittee of German Youth Associations were occupied by 50 Hitler Youth boys. This alone now put Baldur von Schirach in control of approximately 6 million young Germans who were under this youth umbrella. Their opponents, too, were now already or in the process of being subdued. In the wake of the Reichstag fire, in which the Communist Party was proscribed, many Hitler Youth units jumped the gun and went for the NSDAP's other enemy, the SPD. On their own initiative, these boys raided some of the local headquarters of the SPD's youth movement, and the police had to intervene to put an end to these arbitrary acts. The youth groups of Hitler's conservative allies quickly banded together under Admiral von Troffer and founded the Greater German League, and adopted a wait-and-see kind of attitude. They very quickly got in line and pledged loyalty to Adolf Hitler and excluded Jews from their ranks. After the Enabling Act, the Conservatives began to see the writing on the wall. They immediately joined the party and took steps to fuse their own paramilitary and youth movements with those of the NSDAP. Essentially, within mere months, the Hitler Youth either directly or indirectly controlled the entirety of Germany's organized youth. The only exception to this mass absorption was essentially the Catholic youth groups, which an agreement had been worked out with. The Protestant groups attempted to resist, but the Protestant Church was simply too fractured in Germany to maintain resistance for long. The Protestants, one by one, ended up collapsing under the pressure and moved over either wholesale as a group, in some cases, or gradually, over time, in others. Schirach deliberately distanced himself from some of the more anti-Christian elements of the NSDAP and said so publicly. How Hitler Youth approached religion mostly depended on which Gau they were in, but in general, the attitude was a welcoming one. He once said, quote, "It is my purpose neither to re-erect in the forests of Germany heathen altars and introduce youth to any kind of Wotan cult, nor, in any other way, to hand over young Germany to the magical arts of any herb apostles," end quote. And quote, "I shall not suffer in this youth movement anyone who does not believe in God," end quote. Even Admiral von Troffer himself got the hint and accepted an appointment from Schirach as honorary leader of the Marine Hitler Youth, and became one of Schirach's most faithful collaborators. Schirach's own title changed that year too. On the 17th of June, he was made simply Youth Leader of the German Reich, as opposed to his former title of Youth Leader of the NSDAP. The foundation of any new youth movement would now require Schirach's consent, and, obviously, this was never given. The Hitler Youth itself was now divided into its final form. For the boys, there was the Young Volk and the Hitler Youth itself. The former was for 10 to 14-year-olds, and the latter for 14 to 18-year-olds. For the women, there was the Young Madelbund, the Young Girls League, and the BDM, the League of German Girls. Again, the former was for 10 to 14-year-olds, and the latter for 14 to 18-year-olds. This mass expansion of the Hitler Youth did not come without its problems. Obviously, the influx of millions of members became a horrifying bureaucratic nightmare. The lack of trained and experienced leadership also caused headaches. Mass promotions took place from the get-go, and these would almost certainly have been a mixed bag. To solve the problem in the long run, leadership schools were established all across the country, which provided systematic and methodical training for future Hitler Youth leaders. The first of these was established at Potsdam in 1933, and by 1934, 22 such schools existed, and even offered 3-week crash courses to solve the more immediate leadership problems. Besides the obvious leadership training, the syllabus included physical training, rifle shooting, instruction on racial principles, and, of course, German history. By the end of 1933, the Hitler Youth leadership claimed that these courses had created 7,000 leaders already. The following year was dubbed the Year of Training by Schirach, a statement of intent indeed. In his speech, the Hitler Youth leader stated that new leaders were to be produced en masse and emphasized that, quote, "The Hitler Youth is a community of ideological education. Whoever marches in the Hitler Youth is not a number among millions, but the soldier of an idea. The individual member's value to the whole is determined by the degree with which he is permeated by the idea. The best Hitler Youth, irrespective of rank and office, is he who completely surrenders himself to the National Socialist worldview," end quote. In February 1934, Schirach and Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, called for a Reich vocational contest, and the first of its kind took place that year. Here, the best performances of Hitler Youth boys in their respective occupations were assessed and rewarded. 500,000 boys and girls participated that year, and by the 1939 contest, the last of its kind, there were 3.5 million children taking part. The competition was of considerable value for the party, as it provided insight into general training standards of the trades and professions, and it would reveal any gaps to be closed in the interest of the national economy. Another event was introduced the following year, that being the annual Hitler Youth Athletics competition for those between the ages of 10 and 18. Those who met the very specific standards required could win themselves a special medal. Another similar day was the yearly Day of the State Youth, in which the children would get a day off school, which would be dedicated to physical training or paramilitary field games instead of the usual lessons. The most important event of the Nazi calendar was, of course, the Nuremberg Rally. At the 1934 event, foreign reporters claimed that the youth rally was by far the most enthusiastic, and the Führer himself gave his young boys and girls a speech in which he praised them for their past achievements and for attaining such an immaculate level of discipline, a skill which would serve them well later in life. He concluded, quote, "We want to be a peace-loving people, but at the same time, courageous. That is why you must be peaceful and courageous at the same time. We want our people to be honor-loving. To that end, you must from earliest childhood learn the conception of honor. We want to be a proud people, and you must be proud to be the youthful members of the greatest nation. We want an obedient people, and you must learn to practice obedience. We want a people that is not soft, but hard as flint, and we want you from early youth to learn to overcome hardships and privations. There must be no classes or class distinctions amongst our people, and you must never let the idea of class distinctions take root amongst you. All we expect of the Germany of the future, we expect of you. We shall pass on, but Germany will live in you." End quote. As he spoke, the Führer was frequently interrupted by roaring cheers, and at the end of the meeting, the Führer was driven around the stadium so that all his boys and girls could see him or meet him. The Hitler Youth also acquired their very own radio broadcast in 1934, and the Hitler Youth Institute was created specifically to train talented radio speakers. In one of the first broadcasts, the speaker attacked the existing class distinctions in German education, especially the habit of wearing school caps, which set grammar school pupils apart from those of other schools. Shortly afterwards, the hats were banned from all schools and publicly burnt. School teachers who were deemed supporters of the new classless state were publicly honored, and those schools in which over 90% of the pupils were members of the Hitler Youth were given a special Hitler Youth banner. The year 1935 had been the year of physical training, and 1936 was to be the year of the German young Volk, those between 10 and 14 years old. In that year, the aim was to recruit the entire age group born in 1926. Boys and girls who were this age were recommended to volunteer to join the Young Volk and the Young Model by the 20th of April. As a 47th birthday present for the Führer, the Hitler Youth took to the streets and carried out endless campaigns, marches, evenings of choir singings, and parents' evenings in order to get the youngsters on board. Teachers, most of whom had by now joined the party, or at least the National Socialist Teachers League, were asked to persuade and exert pressure on their pupils to sign up. The official celebration for the Führer's birthday took place at Marienburg, the ancient castle of the Teutonic Order in Prussia. Here, the new members swore their oath, which they would swear on every 20th of April from then on until 1945. Quote, "I promise, in the Hitler Youth, to do my duty at all times in love and faithfulness to help the Führer, so help me God." End quote. Koch writes of what came next. Quote, "From then on, boys and girls were on probation for between 2 to 6 months. This period was concluded by a special test, combining sport, close combat, and questions of an ideological nature, mainly on the history of the NSDAP, culminating in Mutprobe, a courage test which would take the form of having to jump in full battle dress and boots from the window of the first floor of a block of flats. After passing the test, the young Volk member was entitled to wear the scout knife, a knife shaped similarly to the bayonet of the German army, the shoulder strap, and the young Volk insignias on the brown shirt." End quote. On the 1st of December 1936, the Law Concerning the Hitler Youth was passed, in which the physical, spiritual, and ethical education, as the party put it, was now the concern of not only school and home, but also the Hitler Youth. Membership now became compulsory from the age of 10. The following years before the outbreak of the war actually ended up being somewhat uneventful. The Hitler Youth had now become institutionalized for the majority of members, with a daily routine and endless repetitiveness. This was a far cry from the years of struggle leading up to 1933, and to many, the whole organization and its activities felt very artificial and forced. In 1938, during Kristallnacht, the boys in various areas voluntarily participated to various degrees in the violence and chaos. Chirac, upon receiving this news, immediately called a meeting of all the Hitler Youth leaders, and he specifically condemned the criminal actions, as he termed it, and forbade any participation going forwards. The Hitler Youth was, by now, even larger. The Anschluss and the annexation of the Sudetenland in recent years have brought a massive new influx into the already bloated organization. By the end of 1938, the total number of youngsters stood at 8.7 million, almost exactly half of whom were girls. The boys were also becoming increasingly militarized. Obergebietsführer Stellrecht had remarked, quote, that it was a remarkable attitude for a nation to spend, out of a number of years, hours in perfecting handwriting and spelling, but not a single hour is available for shooting, end quote. According to him, he would make it so that a rifle would rest as competitively in the hand of the German youth as did the pen, and in 1937, the first Hitler Youth Rifle School came into being, and by the following year, 1.5 million Hitler Youths were being trained in rifle shooting. In the following year, the OKV, the German High Command of the Armed Forces, began to involve itself closely with these activities and supervise the shooting and field exercises. In that same year, 1939, a new law was passed which massively impacted the organization. From now on, all 16 to 18-year-old boys were to perform annual public service. For boys, this tended to mean an activity such as helping with agriculture at harvest time, and the girls would tend to help out in families where there were several children. The law was named the Youth Service Law. By the time war broke out, the Hitler Youth were more than prepared. Most of the boys had gone through 6 years of disciplined training, in which every necessary skill and value had been instilled in them to prepare them for any national struggle of this kind. The others had had even longer than 6 years. In mid-1940, Baldur von Schirach was made Reich Governor of Vienna, and so the head of the Hitler Youth Social Affairs Department, Arthur Axmann, took his place. He proved to be a good appointment, and during difficult times, he was both reliable and an efficient organizer. In the early years of the war, Axmann would actually serve on both fronts. In the east, he would end up losing his right arm. Before the war had even begun, the Hitler Youth were on the scene and doing their part. The call-up papers were not delivered by ordinary postmen in the lead-up to the war, but by the Hitler Youth themselves. And then they, for the entire duration of the war, would deliver the ration cards once a month to each household. All physically fit sick formers were immediately drafted to bring in the harvest, and for most of them, this was the end of their school life forever. They would then move on to the labor service and the army. At this stage, the Hitler Youth had a total of 8,870,000 boys and girls between the ages of 10 and 18 at their disposal. They were commanded by 765,000 leaders, who, increasingly, began to be required in the army. This obviously led to a leadership crisis. More and more Hitler Youth boys were given a chance to prove themselves by filling in these gaps. Over the last few years, the Hitler Youth had for many boys felt rather devoid of purpose. It had all become so monotonous, part of the daily routine, not exciting in the slightest, activity for activity's sake. Now, however, there was a new, meaningful point of it all. They were doing their part in a great national struggle. Even mind-numbing activities, such as the collection of essentially recycling, now became a meaningful task. At war's beginning, the Hitler Youth did exactly this when the government called for the collection of brass, copper, scrap metal, razor blades, paper, and bottles. Off they went, door to door, all across the country. After ringing every doorbell, no matter if it was the first or the 100th of the day, the boys would salute smartly and ask whether the household had any of the items required. If there was no one home that day, then the boys would come back again and again, day after day. During the first winter of the Russian campaign, the Hitler Youth were called upon to ask even more of the German people. They once more went door to door and requested far more precious items than bottles or scrap metal. This time, they were after more cherished items like skis. So many Germans were persuaded to part with their skis in particular that the supply actually ended up exceeding the demand. The girls, meanwhile, were dispatched to the field hospitals to entertain and care for the wounded. Back home, they helped in kindergartens and stood at railway stations waiting for the troops in transit with food and drink. In 1940, the BDM assisted in 318,782 homes, 64,106 in the Red Cross, 60,263 in army hospitals, and 107,185 at railway stations. In the following years, both boys and girls would serve in the newly annexed regions of Poland, where they helped out with the resettlement programs, and helped the new German settlers, and especially farmers, with everyday tasks. Anything that would reduce the reliance on Polish labor was a bonus for the government, and the settlers themselves alike. Some of the boys and girls felt a little uneasy about this task. They were, after all, expelling Poles from their homes to God knows where, and they quite rightly had a lot of questions. In response to these questions, they were told that the Poles were being resettled to farms which the newly arrived ethnic Germans had previously left. These, of course, being Germans from outside of Germany, the Volksdeutsch. This was a lie. Others were also being told that the Poles were being resettled inside the occupied Poland, the general government. There were, of course, not enough farms within the general government to take all these Poles, but the answer was a good enough one for the concerned children. More importantly, they were reminded that after the last war, the Poles had done the exact same thing and expelled the German farmers and treated the remaining Germans horrifically. They were quite right, and the year of 1942 was named the Year of Service in the East and on the Land for the Hitler Youth. From January 1943, the Hitler Youth became even more involved with the war effort, and from then on, they began to man Germany's anti-aircraft batteries. The older boys would man the guns themselves, whilst the younger ones served in the communication network, as well as manning searchlight batteries and serving as dispatch riders. The ages involved tended to be pretty broad at first, but in October 1943, a searchlight position was hit, and the entire crew of boys, all below the age of 14, were killed. The specific ages to be used were then clarified, and the younger age groups were kept from being Luftwaffe helpers. It really was a dangerous job. A German who saw them at work recalled, quote, "In a suburb of Berlin, I saw a row of dead Flakhelfer lying side by side. An air raid had just ended. The flak position, in which these schoolboys served, had received several direct hits. I entered a barrack room in which the survivors had gathered. They sat along the wall and the floor, turning their white faces distorted by terror towards me. Many cried. In another room lay the wounded. One of them, a boy with a soft, round child's face, tried to come to attention when an officer, in whose company I was, asked him whether he suffered any pain. Yes, but this is not important. Germany must be victorious." End quote. There were other matters to attend to regarding the bombing campaign, and that was the civilian victims. Once the raid was over, it was up to party organizations, including the Hitler Youth, to feed and rehouse those who had lost everything. Boys would often be tasked with seeking out vacant flats, or those occupied with only one person, so that bombed-out civilians could move in. Only with reluctance or police involvement would people usually open his or her doors, but regardless, the Hitler Youth did their part. As the Soviets began to approach the Reich's eastern border, the boys were also on task to help. For example, in July and August 1944, a Flieger HJ, so the aviation Hitler Youth, were in Pomerania on a gliding holiday in the Baltic dunes. Whilst there, they received orders to report to Allenstein in East Prussia. Here, they found the local population busily building anti-tank traps and digging anti-tank ditches. Panic was rife in the town, as it was feared that the Russians would now come storming in after the collapse of Army Group Center. The older boys immediately got to work with digging the anti-tank ditches, and the younger boys were ordered to bring supplies to the town on horse carts. Those who were old enough got much more stuck in. In 1943, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend was born. Recruitment was initially intended to be drawn from 17 and 18-year-olds, but in reality, 16-year-olds, and sometimes even younger boys, made it into the division. These boys weren't all strictly the most willing volunteers, but ultimately, they had been raised in a culture of self-sacrifice for the fatherland, so when they spoke of their objections to their superiors, they were quickly won over. This was to be a young division with an extremely strongly developed esprit de corps. On the 6th of June, 1944, the division moved into battle for the first time, and on their 70-mile march to Cannes, they were already torn to shreds by the Allied fighter bombers. Regardless, they pushed on and flew into combat against the Canadians, destroying 28 Canadian tanks at a loss of only 6 of their own. The division continued to fight in this area throughout the rest of the Normandy campaign, and as Australian war reporter Chester Wilmot recorded, quote, "The troops of the 12th SS who were holding this sector fought with a tenacity and ferocity seldom equalled and never excelled during the whole campaign." End quote. One British tank commander recalled that the boys came at their tanks like wolves until, quote, "we were forced to kill them against our will." End quote. This was the Allies' first encounter with the Hitler Youth generation, a new National Socialist breed of German man. They were fanatical and fought valiantly, but ultimately this was not a front in which the Germans, no matter how talented, stood a chance. Within a month, the division had lost 20% of its men killed and 40% missing and wounded. 50% of its tanks and armoured vehicles had also been destroyed. On the 16th of June, their commander had been killed, and he was replaced by Major General Kurt Meyer, the youngest divisional commander at the age of 33. In July, the division was pulled out of the front, but 6 days later was once more thrown back in, this time into the Falaise pocket, where it only managed to later escape with a fraction of its original strength. On the 4th of September, The division crossed the Meuse during its retreat with only 600 men, none of its tanks, and no ammunition for the artillery. Field Marshal von Rundstedt could only comment, quote, "It is a pity that this faithful youth is sacrificed in a hopeless situation," end quote. The division essentially ceased to exist from here. The recruits were from the very bottom of the German manpower reserve barrel, and when it took part in operations in Hungary in February 1945, the division was a complete shell of its former self. On the 8th of May, it surrendered to the Americans with 455 men and 1 tank. These boys were, of course, not the only Hitler Youth in the field. The Volkssturm was created in October 1944, and military service in Home Guard units was made compulsory for every male between the ages of 16 and 60. Recruits were often younger or older than these ages. Even 11-year-olds were able to easily fire the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. There were objections raised at the highest levels of the army regarding this destruction of the young generation, but their concerns were more often than not waved away. To his young warriors, Reichsjudenführer Axmann proclaimed, quote, "There is only victory or annihilation. Know no bounds in your love to your people. Equally, know no bounds in your hatred of the enemy. It is your duty to watch when others are tired, to stand when others weaken. Your greatest honor, however, is your unshakable faithfulness to Adolf Hitler," end quote. The boys certainly took this to heart, and the small bands of Hitler Youth on both fronts caused absolute chaos for the Anglo-Americans and the Soviets alike. In the West, time and again, the Americans found themselves suffering severe casualties from seemingly thin air, and the Hitler Youth boys would just vanish into the forest before they could respond. On the occasions when the boys were caught and cornered, they tended to fight to the very last child. They would undoubtedly have received very fair treatment if they were captured, but regardless, their fanaticism and love for the fatherland knew no bounds, and they were more than willing to give their lives for the cause. In the east, it was in Breslau where the Hitler Youth had their finest hour. The Russians had surrounded the city in March 1945, and Gebietsführer Herbert Hirsch formed a well-equipped Hitler Youth regiment and assigned experienced army NCOs to lead it. These boys caused absolute havoc for the Russians, and time and again, their fanatical counterattacks drove the hordes back, and vital positions were reclaimed for the Germans. The proud locals called the boys' position the Hitler Youth Corner. Until the 9th of May, at the end of the war, when the city surrendered, the boys fought with all they had valiantly. More famously, of course, they fought in the Battle of Berlin. On the 23rd of April, Axmann ordered battalions of Hitler Youth boys to defend the Pickelsdorf bridges across the Havel River in Berlin, so that Wenck's army, Hitler's last hope, could come and relieve the city. The army in the form that Hitler imagined did not exist, and the boys fought in vain. But regardless, they fought extremely well against impossible odds. A diary entry read, quote, "In the shallow trenches before the Pickelsdorf bridge on both sides of the Heerstrasse, separated by smaller or greater distances, lay Hitler Youths with Panzerfausts, alone or in twos. Dawn had already progressed sufficiently to see against the darker background the dark outlines of heavy Russian tanks near the Heerstrasse railway station. Their guns were directed towards the bridge. We found the leader of the defending battle group, from whose mouth we heard the fate of his people. When the fighting started 5 days ago, he told us, there were roughly 5,000 Hitler Youths and a few soldiers available to take on the desperate struggle against the overwhelming odds. Insufficiently equipped with only rifles and Panzerfaust, the boys had suffered terribly by the effects of the Russian artillery barrage. Of the 5,000 boys, only 500 could still be used for combat," end quote. A Wehrmacht officer gave an account of meeting the brave youngsters. Quote, "We asked him how at his age of 13 he comes to be involved in the fighting, and he points to his comrades, who partly come from Oranienburg. Our leader, Hauptbahnführer Frichevsky, and the police fetched us from our homes, and we had to assemble in the SS barracks and on the Schlossplatz. There we were divided up into our Farn lines, and were attached to the SS and the Volkssturm. We first saw action in the north and east of the city. Most of us were killed by infantry fire because we had to attack across the open fields. Then, the fighting in the city. 2 days of it. In 2 days and 2 nights, Oranienburg changed hands 4 times. That finished another part of us. Then, the Russians started bombing the city with the Stalin-Orgel. And, when we wanted to finish and go home, we were stopped and had to join the escape across the canal in the direction of Eden. My young Zugführer, who refused, was strung up on the nearest tree by a few SS men and an SA man. But then he was already 15 years old. This morning, we have been collected together again for our next Einsatz," end quote. The boys' struggle continued all the way up to the entrance of the Führer bunker. In his last public appearance on his 56th birthday, he awarded decorations to some of his brave young boys defending Berlin. Several of the 12-year-olds in attendance received the Iron Cross Second Class. They could not, however, fight on forever. After the Führer had killed himself and the city fell, they began to surrender in their thousands. It was all the same across the country. One group, the youngest of which was merely 10 and the oldest of which was 14, saw an endless column of Sherman tanks come rumbling down Munich's Maximilianstrasse on the 30th of April. The terrified boys had the tanks in the sights of their Panzerfaust, but just couldn't bring themselves to fire. Luckily for them, they were taken captive and lived to tell the tale. There was much talk of resistance after the war in the form of werewolf, especially around Germany's youth. Their war, however, came to an end just like everyone else's. Werewolf never took place, and the youth of Germany had to make do in a new post-war world in which the ideas they had grown up to believe in were now regarded as evil itself. It was to take an awful lot of adjustment. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps immensely. An especially big thank you to those of you who have signed up on Subscribestar or on Ko-fi. It is purely thanks to you, as well as those of you who leave one-time donations on Ko-fi, that I'm able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you enough. Even the lowest tier helps massively. Cheers.